Olá, sou Lucas Henrique da Luz, do IHU. Sejam todas e todos muito bem-vindos, muito bem-vindas a mais um evento do Instituto Humanitas Unisinos. Em nossas atividades virtuais, a participação continua garantida, seja pelo chat do YouTube ou pelo perguntas e respostas da plataforma Teams. Para saber mais sobre a nossa programação, acesse ihu.unisinos.br. Não esqueça de curtir os vídeos, de assinar o nosso canal do YouTube do IHU e de compartilhar os conteúdos do Instituto nas suas redes sociais. A íntegra desse evento ficará disponível no canal do YouTube do IHU e poderá ser acessada e compartilhada quando você quiser. Hoje damos continuidade ao 19º Simpósio Internacional IHU, Homo Digitalis, a escalada da algoritmização da vida em tempos de pandemia, com a segunda conferência deste simpósio. A digitalização da vida é um tema tratado pelo IHU há mais tempo, por meio de artigos, entrevistas, produzidas e publicadas no site do IHU. Além disso, em maio de 2008, realizamos um simpósio internacional com o tema título Uma Sociedade Pós-Humana, Possibilidades e Limites das Nanotecnologias. O 19º Simpósio Internacional IHU, Homo Digitalis, a escalada da algoritmização da vida em tempos de pandemia, soma-se a estas reflexões já realizadas e teve em sua concepção o apoio de diferentes programas de pós-graduação da Unisinos. O PPG em Comunicação, em Saúde Coletiva, em Computação Aplicada, em Gestão e Negócios, em Educação, em Economia, em Direito, em Filosofia, dentre outros. Agradecemos de maneira especial os professores pesquisadores José Roque Jungs, Pedro Gilberto Gomes e Rafael Grohan. Citando-os, simbolizamos o nosso agradecimento a todas e todos, professores, professoras, pesquisadores, pesquisadoras, que se envolveram na viabilização deste simpósio. Além disso, agradecemos o apoio e o fomento da FAPERGS, Fundação de Amparo à Pesquisa do Estado do Rio Grande do Sul. A dinâmica do simpósio conta com conferências internacionais gravadas exclusivamente para nosso evento por reconhecidos pesquisadores de diferentes partes do mundo. Conferências estas que são debatidas por pesquisadores brasileiros, especialistas dos temas em debate. Para a nossa segunda conferência, que acontece nesse momento, recebemos por vídeo, previamente gravado e legendado em português, o professor Dr. Nick Couldry, da London School of Economics and Political Science, na Inglaterra. O professor Couldry apresentará a conferência Colonialismo de dados e esvaziamento da vida social antes e pós-pandemia do Covid-19. Conferência essa que será comentada e debatida pelo professor Dr. Norval Baitello Júnior, da PUC São Paulo, a quem desde já agradecemos. Destaco que esse evento está sendo transmitido ao vivo pela plataforma Teams, pelo YouTube no canal do IHU e no Facebook do CEPAT, Centro de Promoção de Agentes de Transformação, parceiro estratégico do IHU. Para sua comodidade, também transmitimos o evento na homepage do IHU. Atenção, um aviso importante. Se você se matriculou ou pretende se matricular neste evento, lembre-se de acessar e preencher o formulário disponível no link Perguntas e Respostas do Teams. É rápido e fácil. Em caso de dificuldade, envie suas dúvidas, seus comentários pelos chats, tanto do Teams como do YouTube, que a nossa equipe poderá ajudá-lo. Conforme destacado anteriormente, hoje recebemos o professor Dr. Nick Couldry em conferência gravada e legendada. E para o debate com o público e suas considerações, o professor Dr. Norval Baitello Júnior. Nick Couldry é professor de Mídia, Comunicação e Teoria Social no Departamento de Mídia e Comunicação da Escola de Economia e Ciência Política de Londres. Como sociólogo de mídia e cultura, ele aborda a comunicação pela perspectiva do poder simbólico, historicamente concentrado nas instituições midiáticas. Seu trabalho se baseou e contribui para a teoria social, espacial, democrática e cultural, antropológica e ética da mídia e das comunicações. Sua análise da mídia como prática tem sido amplamente influente. Professor Couldry é autor de diversos livros, dos quais destacamos The Cost of Connection e o outro livro, Media, Voice, Space and Power, ambos livros de 2019, além de vários outros. A conferência, gravada pelo professor Couldry, terá aproximadamente 1 hora de duração e depois teremos as considerações do professor Dr. Norval Baitello Jr., a quem eu vou apresentar logo após assistirmos à conferência. Com a palavra, o professor Dr. Nick Couldry.
Giving you this lecture today about data colonialism and the reconstruction of the social world before and after COVID-19. First of all, let me get my slides up for today's lecture. There we are. What I want to do in this lecture is to introduce you to the argument of the book for capitalism. I want to give you the context of that book's argument as a way into thinking about the impacts of data colonialism on the social world, the everyday world in which you and I live, in the countries where we live. And then move on at the end of the lecture to think how that context, that long-term context of data colonialism, is relevant to the particular crisis of the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic. The core question of our book is really very simple. What is going on with data? In other words, how should we frame, how should we understand all the new and the not so new things going on with big data, artificial intelligence, machine learning across business? I talk about capitalism, the idea that we're entering a new stage of capitalism called digital capitalism or informational capitalism, or perhaps more interestingly, platform capitalism. And most famously, Shoshana Zuboff's idea that we're living in a surveillance capitalism, or more modestly, perhaps, the idea that it's a data capitalism. Well, there's a lot of importance in those various ideas, and we acknowledge that in our book. But we ask in our book whether something potentially even larger is going on with data today. Something that really will, we know, have gone on for at least 500 years, because it was historical colonialism starting in Latin America around about 1500 that laid the ground for what we now know as capitalism. And we get hints of this colonial link to the new oil. Oil, of course, being the most common image of a colonial asset. Is this phrase just a harmless metaphor? Or could it be an ideology that covers up, that makes almost seem natural to us, a major new phase in grabbing the planet's resources, a historic land grab that truly does deserve the name of a new colonialism? Well, that possibility that there might be something deeply colonial going on with data today emerged in discussions about the scandal of 2 years ago around Cambridge Analytica, a small data company that used Facebook's microdata on hundreds of thousands of people using the platform of Facebook to target at them messages that were designed to influence their political opinions. And a few weeks after the scandal broke, the person who broke it, Christopher Wiley, who used to work for Cambridge Analytica, was asked about Cambridge Analytica's plans to expand its desperate attempts to influence politics into India. And he said they were true. And he said, this is what modern colonialism looks like. This is what modern colonialism looks like. That was interesting. So the question is, what could this mean? Well, we argue in our book that this is not about a metaphor. Many people use the metaphor of colonialism to refer to bad things. And that's too easy. That doesn't help us understand the reality of what's going on. No, in our book, we are definitely and genuinely saying that what is going on with data everywhere today across the world genuinely represents, in reality, a new phase, a new stage in the development of colonialism, a data colonialism, that in the long run will prepare the ground for a new mode of capitalist production, just as the original colonialism 500 years ago prepared the ground for industrial capitalism, which emerged 200 years later. And this new colonialism grabs a different type of asset from the old one. The old colonialism grabbed land. It grabbed the minerals and the farm products of the land. And of course, it grabbed the people, mainly slaves, to extract those values from the land. But today's new data colonialism grabs us, human beings, the stuff, the flow of our everyday lives. And of course, it's important to remember that historic colonialism has not died. Even though the institutions of old colonial governments have disappeared, the relics, the leftovers of historical colonialism still continue, and they coexist with this new data colonialism and its legacy. You might immediately have a question, particularly living in Brazil, which was at the heart of this historic colonialism. Can this new colonialism, this data colonialism that operates across our mobile phones, our laptops, our tablets, can it really be colonialism? Because does it match the violence, the horrific violence of historical colonialism? And certainly we are not saying that it does. But what we are saying is that there are continuities between this new colonialism and historic colonialism, which should alarm us. And I want to take you through these. So, what is data colonialism as we understand it in the book? Well, here's a condensed version of our definition. Data colonialism, we argue, is an emerging social and economic order for the appropriation of human life so that data can be continuously extracted from it for profit. So it's a way of configuring the whole world just so that something, a new resource, can be grabbed. And that resource is human life, from which economic value can be extracted. I say there for profit, but of course the value can be extracted in other forms too, such as the social benefits that governments get from tracking us more closely when they get access to the information that commercial corporations have about us. To make this argument, we need to make a strong distinction between colonialism, which, as I said, in many of its institutional forms, historic colonialism, ended in the 1960s, 1970s with the post-colonial movement. But we have to distinguish that, the institutional form, from what the Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano called coloniality. Coloniality are the ways of thinking, the basic idea that the world is there to be taken by one part of the world, by the colonial powers. And that idea lives on, and it is now actualized in the new colonialism, the new coloniality of data colonialism. So we're arguing that yes, the modes in which this new colonialism operates, perhaps some of its intensities, the scales on which it operates, many of its contexts are different from the historical colonialism, which we all understand about so well. But the function, the underlying purpose, the core goal of this new colonialism is exactly the same as that of historical colonialism. It is to dispossess, to take, to grab the world's resources for the benefit of the few, for the benefit of one part of the world. You may still be skeptical about this argument. So let me sum up right away what Ulysses and I feel are the advantages of this approach to understanding what is going on with data in the global north as well as the global south. It is a controversial principle, so let's see what might be the advantages of this colonial perspective on what's happening with data. And there are basically two types of advantages, some to do with the scope on which we understand what's going on, and others to do with how we understand the depth of the consequences of what is going on with data. Let's start with the advantages of scope. And we can start with the question of timescale. A colonial perspective allows us to look back in history, not just over the past 4 decades, the decades, of course, in which the internet emerged as a commercial phenomenon, and then, of course, more recently, social media platforms emerged. But we can look back in a colonial perspective much further, over the past 500 years. And that enables us to also look further into the future, not looking about what is just happening today, but on the analogy of historic colonialism, to look ahead to the future stage of capitalism, which might be generated by this new data colonialism today. Seeing what's going on with data as a new, historically significant form of resource extraction, just as significant as that of the original historic colonialism. There's another advantage of scope, which is in terms of the types of activities we think are relevant for this new colonialism. It's not just a matter of what we normally talk about, our social media platforms, Facebook, or relatedly, Google. These are really important, but they are only just part of what's going on with data through data colonialism. Also very important is the massive expansion of surveillance and monitoring of human bodies across many forms of work today, especially low status work. Profound transformation in the conditions of labor today. Also important is the emergence of completely new situations of work, the so-called gig economy, Uber, Lyft, Airbnb, and so on and so forth. All of these are different ways of generating value through the use of platforms and always through the extraction of data. Then also relevant is the expansion of logistics. On the face of it, uncontroversial. All of us want our packages via Amazon to arrive on time. But what that requires is the moment-to-moment tracking of the movement of goods across space, which in turn, of course, involves the tracking of the workers who are involved in moving those goods, expanding, intensifying the role of surveillance in this new datafied economy. So logistics is important. And then finally, most neglected of all, we need to look, as part of data colonialism, at the rise of internal corporate data. It's very interesting that IBM, a very large company, which is not often thought of as part of today's big tech, because it has no social media platforms, has its own very distinctive view of data colonialism. and the opportunities of the data age. In its annual report 3 or 4 years ago, IBM said it wasn't worried by the big tech platforms because 80% of the world's valuable data, it argued, is internal corporate data, the data inside corporate data flows. But that's interesting, because what corporations regard as internal data to them might actually be the detail from our everyday lives. If, for example, we have a smart fridge where the question of whether I have milk or not in that fridge might be a personal choice for me, but it's also data of that device, which from the point of view of the manufacturer of that device and its server is internal data to that corporation. So those are the advantages of scope in terms of how broadly we look in time and in space at the phenomenon of data colonialism, what is going on with data. But there's another type of advantage in terms of the depth of how we understand the transformations that are coming from what is going on with data. Because we're arguing in our book that this is not just a matter of a few incidental technologies or uses of media. We are looking at the building of a new social and economic order, a new way of living, which all of us are involved in building, that will bind together in new ways every aspect of our lives, bringing about new forms of dependency on technology, on connection, new forms of governing us, new ways of ruling us, all based in values that seem very positive, the values of convenience, customization, or as the marketers often call it, personalization. Because of course, to have personalized adverts, you have to be continuously subject to personalized surveillance. So a colonial perspective, which reminds us of the new, radically different social order that emerged when colonial powers came to Latin America, helps us see that today we are looking at the emergence of a radically new social order. And then finally, perhaps the deepest continuity between today's new data colonialism and historic colonialism is at the level of rationality, the underlying logic or thinking that makes possible, that makes justifiable the grabbing of the world's resources by a small part of the world. This is the idea that the West has a special privileged relation to rationality, which from 1500 onwards in the court of Spain was used to justify the idea that Spain could grab Latin America's resources. Quijano calls that the underlying principle of coloniality. And we argue that this is the core of all the discourses around data, big data, tech for social good, and so on, that are spreading in business and in civil society today. Because underlying all of these are the connections between power and knowledge and rationality that lie at the heart of modernity and at the heart of colonialism, and that connections that we only understand if we draw on decolonial thinkers, critics of colonialism, not just on those who criticize capitalism. So those, I think, are the advantages of this colonialist perspective. But in the book, we also put a lot of time into unfolding what it means to think colonially about what is going on with data today, in terms of how it changes our view of the history of everything that's led up to this, and the opportunities it gives to reinterpret what's going on today in our present, in the new things that we are all getting used to with our devices, with the new platforms, particularly in the COVID crisis, and to understand them in a colonial perspective, through the eyes, through the lens of the past 500 years of the relations between colonialism and capitalism. Let me just give you one example of of how colonial history helps us illuminate what is going on every day in the banal details of our lives. And I want to compare two documents. And here I'm drawing on an idea, a great idea that Ulysses had as we began preparing our book. Here's one very familiar document, familiar in a sense. These are the terms of service that you agree to when you install Google Chrome on your laptop or on your mobile phone or on your tablet or whatever. And many, of course, do use Google Chrome. It's one of the world's dominant internet engines. Now, this is what you agree to when you install Google Chrome. You give Google a perpetual, irrevocable, worldwide, royalty-free, and non-exclusive license to reproduce, adapt, modify, translate, publish, publicly perform, publicly display, and distribute any content which you submit, post, or display on or through the services. That's pretty comprehensive. And of course, you probably never read those terms of service. No one does. They go on for pages and pages. No one has time. All they want is to get on and use Google Chrome to find out what they need to find out right now. No one has time to read these terms of services. Almost no one does. And if they do, they probably don't understand them in any detail because they're meant to be very difficult to understand. So let's compare these very normal, banal terms of services to which most of us have already agreed with another document from 500 years ago. And that document was called the Requerimiento. This was a document written in 1513 in the Spanish court to give legal justification to the King of Spain's grabbing the resources of Latin America. People were worried in the Spanish court that there was no legal basis for doing this. They were very worried also that the indigenous people of Latin America were potential Christians. So how could it be justified simply to take everything they had or to kill them? It couldn't, on the face of it, if they were potential Christians. People with souls that might be lost. Later on, the view of those potential Christians changed and they were regarded as savages who didn't have any rights. But at the beginning, that was not the view. And it was the decision that it was needed to give a legal justification to this grabbing of resource. And that was done through the document called the Requerimiento, which we've translated a little bit of it there. This document would be read out by conquistadors, or on horseback, I guess, in the middle of the night, 2 or 3 miles outside the village where the next day they wanted to take the gold. They would, of course, read it in Spanish, a language they knew for certain that the local people did not understand, and the local people were not there. This was 2 or 3 miles outside the village in the middle of the night. But they will read this document out. And here's an example translated into English of what the document said. It said that if you do not submit to us grabbing your gold, basically, then I certify to you that with the help of God, we shall powerfully enter into your country and shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we can. And we shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and of their royal highnesses. We shall take you and your wives and your children and shall make slaves of them, and as such shall sell and dispose of them as their highnesses may command. And we shall take away your goods and shall do you all the mischief and damage that we can. The terms of service of the Spanish colonial invasion, 1513, Requerimiento, please accept and install. So the parallels are really quite striking. Now let's think about who is doing this. In the book, we call the various companies involved in this colonial expansion that grabs human life for profit. We call them the social quantification sector, which is the industry sector devoted to the development of the infrastructure required for these massive range of activities of data extraction from everyday life. We know, of course, the big companies involved, often called in the West GAFA, Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon. We can often add in Microsoft as well. And then in China, a parallel set of massive platforms and organizations: Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, Xiaomi. All these companies, we argue in the book, are of course monopolies, and it's very common to talk of them as monopolies, but there's something even bigger than that. They're also what economists call monopsonies. Monopolies are those who have a monopoly in selling things to you. They're a monopsony, because if you like cats, you like nice pictures and videos of cats that you film on your phone, you want to put them somewhere and share them with your friends. Where else will you go except YouTube? Because you know everyone else goes there. That's the place you have to, as it were, sell your cat video to. But of course, because there's nowhere else to sell it, you don't get anything in return except the use of the service. Your price falls to zero. And that's exactly the way monopsonies work in economics. So we're looking at monopoly, monopsony hybrids. Google is a clear example of this, and it has a very strong parallel in the history of colonialism, which was the British East India Company, which was both the seller of goods and the buyer of last resort in India, dominating the whole economy, economically and through military force. But these are just the big players. There are many other players of different sizes in the social quantification sector, involved in hardware, software, platforms of all sorts and sizes, data analytics that processes the data gathered from the platforms, and data brokerage, data companies that sell on to other third parties the data that's gathered from the platforms. So I've given you in the past 30 minutes the general shape of our argument in the book Costs of Connection about data colonialism. And I hope at least it's of interest to you. It's a controversial argument. It's a complex argument, but I've given you the basic shape of it. What I want to do in the next part of the lecture, given that the theme of this whole lecture series is the transformation of the social world through media infrastructures, what I want to do is to think about the role of data colonialism in our everyday social world, when it's installed as a basic dynamic of the everyday world that you and I share with our friends, our family, our employers, the institutions we know. And the first step here to think about is what we call in the book data relations. How is it that the social quantification sector works to build a new social order? Here we need to think about theorists of capitalism. We need to go back to Karl Marx, but use his theory creatively. Karl Marx, you may remember, explained the reproduction of capitalism as a social phenomenon exclusively through labor relations, through each of us agreeing to sell our work in commodified form in return for wages in a labor market, a commodified labor market. Without doubt, that remains a very important part of how capitalism, including in the new context of data colonialism, actually works. But it's not enough to understand what is going on, the transformations going on with data colonialism. And the reason for that is that we know the data is being extracted from us, even when we know we are not working. When I relax at the weekends, send some pictures to my friends and family about us having a meal, just hanging out together, something nice we see and we know someone in our family would enjoy seeing right now through WhatsApp or whatever. I know that at that moment, I am not working. That's the one moment I get maybe in my week not to work, not to be under pressure for someone else, an employer. But we also know that at those moments too, data is being extracted from us. Economic value is being generated through the data that is contained, including the metadata linked to the images that I'm sending and how I'm sending them. That means we need to think about the reproduction of capitalism today, not just through labor relations, but through data relations, which we define in the book as ways of reproducing social life. Basically, everything we do, all the interactions we're involved in, for a new purpose, which is to optimize the extraction of data for profit. And it helps to understand this massive expansion of capitalism's ways of reproducing itself by drawing on a radical theorist in the Marxist tradition, Moshe Poston, who died 2 years ago. And he argued that the core of Marx's original theory of capitalism and how it reproduces itself socially was not labor relations. And it was not even the commodification of activities that makes possible capitalist labor relations on a labor market. Instead, it was the core fundamental act of abstraction. Abstracting from the flow of things that I do, a task, an abstract task, which is defined such that it can be sold for a price on a labor market. And that idea of abstraction, taking from the flow and mess of our daily lives, the things that pass through our minds, the things we just want to say or share with those we love, and abstracting from it activities which are bounded, which can generate specific outcomes that could have a specific price for which they could be sold on a data market. That is abstraction. That is the core of what is going on with data today. And that is also the core, if we read Marx right, of how capitalism has always been socially reproduced for the past 2 centuries. It's just that it's now operating through a second modality, which is data, not just labor relations. And through this, ordinary social life, everything in social life, including those times when we know we are not working, can become a direct factor, an input to capitalist production, which means more broadly that human life itself is being annexed to capitalism through processes of continual monitoring and influenced by marketers of our behavior, with profound implications for freedom, or what in the book we call the very core of freedom, the space of the self. And we know how this happens every day, how we somehow agree to this, whatever we think about it. It happens, we fall into the spiral of data relations every time we load an app on our phone, when we join a platform, when we set up a smart device, smart fridge, etc., to work in our home. We know that we are accepting the terms and conditions of data extraction. We're entering that spiral of data relations. What's interesting here, and it's an important point, is that we do this normally without any physical struggle. We just click, press on our phone, and it happens. There's no violence there, obviously. So isn't that a fundamental difference with historic colonialism? And yes, it is. But there's a very good reason for this difference. And the reason is that when historic colonialism began 500 years ago, it was a relation between 2 groups of people who had no basis for social relations. They didn't know each other in any way. This was the new world being discovered by surprise by the Europeans. And as a result, there were only two ways of grabbing the gold: physical violence and lying. And the conquistadors used both. But today, the new colonialism operates on a completely different basis. It comes in and follows on from 2 centuries of us being accustomed to capitalist social relations. So there really is no need for physical violence much of the time. Just a small adjustment to the legal background that governs how my phone operates is sufficient for me to change the relationship between me and the flow of my everyday life, and to lose control of it, to pass over control of those data flows to an external corporation. That's a big difference, and it is at the core of the way that data colonialism operates. So, as I said, the next question is, how does this make a difference on a larger scale to our social world? And chapter 4 of our book looks at this in great detail. A crucial point that we rely on in our book is another point from Marx, that big economic change doesn't just happen because the economy is part of society. Economic change only happens when there is a profound transformation of social relations. Marx's theory of commodification of the commodity fetish was his way of explaining that in the historical circumstances of the late 19th century. Another great economic thinker, the economic historian Karl Polanyi, 60 or 70 years later, in his book, The Great Transformation, reflected on the emergence of industrial capitalism in Europe, again, in terms of the transformation of social history. He argued, Polanyi, that a market economy can only exist in a market society. In other words, you first have to transform social relations so that they can become market relations. And he argued this happened in the early 19th century through highly artificial stimulants administered to the body social. It's a very interesting phrase. He's writing about the early 19th century, but I think you could not have a better phrase to sum up what Facebook was when it was introduced as a platform in 2005. A highly artificial stimulant administered to the body social. As a result of which, Polanyi says, in the 19th century, all transactions turn into money transactions, but we could say in the early 21st century, all transactions have turned into data transactions. Transactions organized around the generation of data. And there's a deeper aspect to this, which is that for the first time in human history, the production of knowledge, the production of how we know the social world around us, becomes fused with the production of profit, because data is both a small part of information which becomes knowledge, and at the same time, it is a unit that can generate profit, that can be exchanged in a market for profit. So we are arguing in the book that as part of data colonialism, a profound new social transformation is underway, a new social order, which is making possible the economic transformations implied by data colonialism, which will lay the ground for a new capitalism at some point in the future. Now, these changes in the social world are really very complex because they involve every aspect of the social world, including how we know the social world, the basic facts and information we have to talk about the social world. So this is very complex, and it helps to understand the consequences of data colonialism for social knowledge to make another historical comparison, to compare today's new form of social knowledge through data with the old model of social knowledge that was part of the transformation that Karl Polanyi talked about in his analysis of the emergence of industrial capitalism. That older social knowledge was in the form of statistics, facts about societies, poverty, suicide, and so on, which emerged as a massive movement in the 19th century, which was part of building modern government and the modern economy. That knowledge in the 19th century was all publicly funded. The data was gathered through the activities of governments, through censuses, through public statistics gathering. The data was analyzed publicly. It was put to use in public policy as part of public debate. All this was out in the open and very much a matter of political controversy in the European states and also in the United States in the 19th century. And as a result of it, although there are many problems with this form of social knowledge and what it excluded and what it included, nonetheless, a better aspect of it was that this social knowledge was publicly accountable. It was argued about in public. There were major controversies involving social scientists, even novelists like Charles Dickens became involved in the debate about whether statistics proved that we have no free will. This was out there in the open, and as a result, whatever the problems of this form of social knowledge, it was relatively transparent. People had a rough sense of how the knowledge was produced and therefore what the problems with that knowledge might be. And that's the model of social knowledge from where, for example, many of our fundamental concepts today in modern democracies, such as the concept of poverty as something socially caused through various aspects of the economy and various social phenomena, housing, families, and so on. That's where that idea of poverty as something socially caused came from, through this expansion of publicly generated social knowledge. So the question for thinking about the impacts of data colonialism today is, what impacts is data colonialism having on our new forms of social knowledge? Well, one thing we do know is that new form of social knowledge generated by the gathering of data is overwhelmingly in private hands. It's privately funded. It's privately connected by Facebook, Google, many other corporations that I've already mentioned. It's analyzed in private. The uses of it happen in private, for private profit most of the time, unless governments are given privileged access, for which they have to negotiate. The meanings of this new social knowledge are debated in private, inside boardrooms, not out there in public, at public meetings. As a result, this new social knowledge that is so important in our lives is largely accountable only in private. It's disputed in private. There's not much public debate about a lot of this knowledge, and therefore it is definitely not transparent in how it's produced and how it's used. It is opaque. We can't see into how this datafied knowledge of the social world is being produced and used for or against us. And we know there are good reasons why this information is not fully transparent. Some of it is just due to its complexity. Google engineers themselves cannot tell you exactly how, moment to moment, the Google search algorithm is working, because it has millions of variables, all of them interacting and drawing on past uses of those same algorithms. There is no linear way to predict how the algorithm operates at this moment on this search. No one can tell you. It's too complex. It's not fully transparent. It cannot be. But there are also good commercial reasons why Google will let you know the details of its algorithm. This new form of social knowledge is sometimes called the God view. The God view. This was the phrase used by Uber executives, and an example of using it came out in a report by journalists of a party that Uber executives held to celebrate their massive success of their platform. At the party, they used to put up on a wall a picture of all Uber cars in San Francisco at any one time. Sometimes for fun, they would de-anonymize the car so you could see that Nick Couldry was yet again driving on a Friday night across San Francisco in the same direction. Why, maybe? Interesting. Maybe they just did that for fun. Maybe we shouldn't take that so seriously. But let's take another example from the chief executive officer of ShotSpotter, an American company that's involved in providing algorithmic decision-making tools for the American justice system. He was in a court case where his algorithm was being used to help a judge decide whether to send someone to jail or not. He refused to give details of the algorithm, saying it was his, it was private. And when he was asked by the newspapers why he took this position, he said, well, it's mine. The judge was asking for the details of the algorithm. That's like taking someone's Netflix subscription. And of course, one's Netflix subscription really is private. But then how can this be that the knowledge that is used to justify whether someone goes to prison or not is so private that it can't be released to the judge who's making that decision, even though it's a fundamental form of social knowledge? There's something deeply wrong here. This idea that we can know the social world now sufficiently through proxies generated by impersonal automated algorithms, not just through our observations, our knowledge, through talking to people about that world we inhabit. There's something deeply puzzling here. And yet this social knowledge, this new form of datafied social knowledge is spreading right across the social world, in marketing, in the insurance sector, as I've already said, in the managing of people through continuous surveillance, for example, in Amazon warehouses, in the Internet of Things, where we are now sold objects for our homes, which still do the same things. They keep our food cold, like a fridge. They give us a sound when someone comes to our door and rings the bell. But now they also gather data about us, those who visit us, what we put in our fridges, data which is stored externally by an external corporation under their control. Marketers now have a new vision of why they sell goods and services to us. And they argue that it's not just about gathering data up to the point of sale to encourage us to buy something, but the data extraction goes on after sale, when we still have the product in our home. This is what they call continuous product relationship management. And the Internet of Things is exactly part of that. Sometimes we volunteer to generate data. Self-measurement through Fitbits, Apple Watches, many other devices. As I saw a moment ago, courts, the management of crime, social services are increasingly relying on algorithms to make their decisions. A very interesting example in Latin America is how Microsoft has been involved in the expansion of the Horus project, which has relied on algorithmic measures for poverty and welfare and the various factors that lead to social suffering. Developed first in Argentina, last year the Brazilian government discussed the possible expansion of that in Brazil too. For example, in northeast Brazil, in the region of Campina Grande. These are just some of the many examples of the expansion of data colonialism in the production of social knowledge. And it's changing the social world as we live it, because it's changing how we know that world, how we act in that world. So, as American sociologists Fourcade and Healy argue, the old rationales for why you might give poor people in a society more favorable terms because they were poor and therefore needed help, this is at least American and perhaps British society we're talking about. I know the history in Brazil is much more difficult. But that idea, that charitable approach to poverty, that approach in terms of social justice is being replaced with the idea that the terms of credit for the poor should depend solely on prior credit-related behavior, which of course is not judged by a human being, but is tracked by an algorithm. Some people are afraid that as courts adopt algorithms to make their decisions about sentencing and other things, that it's hollowing out the decision-making capacity of public servants within what is called a new governance by proxy. I'm quoting from American and Israeli legal scholars there. All of this, we could argue, is removing, it's erasing voice. That fundamental democratic value, voice, is being removed from the way we produce knowledge, the way we know our social world. And we need to look ahead. This is just the present. Where is this going? Well, let me give you 2 or 3 quotes. A report by the well-known management consultants PricewaterhouseCoopers 6 years ago, called The Wearable Future, looked ahead to a situation when data was gathered from us not just by tracking machines that we wear, like a Fitbit, but ones which were implanted in our bodies, chips under the skin. And they speculate brands could even take body cues to tailor messages, to personalize messages. And they ask sensor revealing that you're thirsty. Well, here's a coupon for smart water in the supermarket round the corner where we know you went yesterday and bought water and other things. Insurers are also very interested, looking ahead to the future of more intense data collection. Here's A.T. Kearney, leading consultants to the American insurance industry, who wrote the same year that insurers could use Internet of Things enriched relationships. That's the continuous product management we talked about before. They could use that to connect more holistically to customers. That sounds nice, but why? Well, the next words explain it. Why? To influence their behaviors ever more continuously. And the deeper logic of this emerged in an important article in the Harvard Business Review, which came out just a month or 2 before we published our book, where 2 writers, business professors from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, said that marketing needs to be fundamentally rethought in terms of new strategies of continuous connection, which go beyond traditional ways in which marketers have interacted with customers and offer a fundamentally new business model, which for them has 4 stages. First, respond to desire. That's sort of familiar. You want an ice cream and someone is selling you a nice ice cream. Curated offering, which is to arrange the possibilities in the market so that you want more ice creams more often, because they seem to be a very nutritious form of food that's regularly available to you. Coach behavior starts to become stranger. This is where we're continuously sent messages to encourage us to desire ice cream more and more and see it as perhaps important for our health or our psychic well-being. And then finally, most sinister of all, automatic execution. So when our fridge finds that in our freezer we no longer have any ice cream, it knows we want ice cream as soon as possible. So it sends a message to a local supermarket using prepayment, and suddenly some ice cream is delivered to our door just at the moment we open the fridge and think, oh my God, I've run out of ice cream. Automatic execution. Before I end the lecture, I want to run through 2 final things. The first question, how could we resist a social order as complex, as deep as that of data colonialism? One-track approaches won't work. It's just not enough for me to say that I won't stay on Facebook or that I won't buy a smart fridge, because many other people are doing this. A social order is being built around this. New homes today, new apartments already have smart data, digital personal assistants like Amazon Echo built into them. This is the social order. It's being built. So individual opting out is not enough. It's very important to remember that we're not all affected equally by this new order, because we're still dealing with the legacies of historic colonialism, of course. And the new data colonialism will go on treating very differently those who suffer from racial, class, and economic differences in the past. Those disadvantages will be reproduced in the present, but in ways that are more opaque and therefore more effective than before. And that relates to all the important work in critical data studies about racist biases of algorithms. How can we resist this? Well, first of all, we need to think seriously, collectively, about reclaiming our time, the space of our lives, from these forces of colonization. And one way we can do that is by naming what is going on as data colonialism and learning from past decolonization struggles, reimagining our relations to technology, thinking about what it would mean to have solidarity in the face of this massive new social and economic order, thinking, following the great work of Latin American thinkers such as Paulo Freire and Ivan Illich, thinking about what it will be to build common knowledge under conditions of connection, yes, but not on these terms of connection that data colonialism offers to us. All the time, imagination is crucial. And that is why we wrote our book, The Cost of Connection. So there are possibilities to resist, and they require common effort. But they have been made more difficult, without doubt, by the particular challenge of COVID-19. We know why. Because the pandemic is forcing us to stay in our homes. The government's responses to the pandemic, responses to the physical risk of the spread of the virus, is requiring us to stay home. Many of us, most of us, which means we're reliant on digital platforms such as Zoom, which I'm using right now as I speak to you, which of course have their profit models based on the extraction of data. It's hard to resist. It's hard to find alternatives. But there's also a deeper way in which data colonialism is being reinforced, which is that in this new world, the platforms, the big tech companies that build them, are positioning themselves as the providers of the social solutions that government and society need, something I'd written about with my Brazilian colleague, João Magalhães, earlier in the year. In other words, in COVID-19 and the reactions to it, everyday life, wherever we live, whether Brazil or Britain or United States or South Africa or India, is increasingly being organized around platforms, around their needs, around their functionalities, not necessarily around our needs, our values. Their needs are to extract data for value. The force of data colonialism is increasingly being installed as the force, as the focus around which everyday life and changes in everyday life are organized, possibly accelerating the forces of data colonialism by 5 years, maybe even by 10 years. This is the reality that we're all living today. This is how our societies are being changed. These new, largely hidden, very broad, very powerful forces of data colonialism, which are building a new social order and will build a new stage of capitalism. It's clear what these forces are. What's unknown yet is whether we will resist. But Ulysses and I are certain we must resist. And I hope this lecture has given you something to think about the necessity of resistance and the possibilities of resisting data colonialism, particularly now in this difficult time of COVID-19. Thank you very much for listening. That's where you can find out more information about the book and articles that we've written recently. You're welcome to get in touch with me personally by email if you want to follow up with any questions. And I know you'll be having a debate after the lecture, and I hope that's interesting and productive for you. And it's been very nice talking to you, and I wish you all the best. Bom dia.
Mais uma vez, obrigado ao professor Nick Couldry. Conforme anunciado previamente, agora contaremos com as considerações do professor Dr. Norval Júnior sobre o tema da conferência. E, em seguida, abriremos para a interação dele com o público, com todos e todas. Norval é doutor em Ciências da Comunicação e em Literatura Comparada pela Universidade Livre de Berlim, com estágio pós-doutoral no Instituto de Sociologia da Universidade Livre de Berlim e no Centro Internacional de Pesquisas em Ciências da Cultura, em Viena. É professor titular da PUC-São Paulo, atuando no programa de pós-graduação em Comunicação e Semiótica. Fundou e dirige o Centro Interdisciplinar de Pesquisa em Semiótica da Cultura e da Mídia. É autor de diferentes livros e, dentre eles, vamos destacar Existências Penduradas, Selfies, Retratos e Outros Penduricalhos, editora Unisinos 2019, A Era da Iconofagia, da Paulus 2014, e A Serpente, a Maçã e o Holograma, Esboços para uma Teoria da Mídia, Paulus 2010. Destaco ainda, de forma especial, uma entrevista concedida pelo professor Norval para a revista IHU Online de número 375, entrevista que pode ser encontrada no sítio do IHU e tem como título Estudar a história dos tempos profundos da imagem significa também buscar raízes da própria escrita. Professor Norval, muito obrigado por aceitar o nosso convite. Com o senhor a palavra.
Bom dia a todos. Eu que agradeço, Lucas, agradeço pelo convite, agradeço de estar aí com vocês no IHU e sobretudo, agradeço pela oportunidade de comentar esta rica conferência que tivemos com o colega Nick Couldry, sobre o livro dele em parceria com o Ulisses Mejias. Enfim, vamos logo aos comentários, que é claro que uma conferência como esta, com tanta riqueza de dados e de reflexões, e sobretudo com tanta coragem civil, de tocar nesses assuntos tão difíceis para os nossos dias de hoje, e ainda mais difíceis agora, nessa época de Covid. Então, eu escolhi alguns tópicos específicos para tratar e para destacar na conferência dele, na conferência do Nick Couldry. Então, o título da minha fala é O que custa o virtual? Existe uma alusão ao título do livro dele, The Costs of Connection, então, os custos da conexão. E o que custa o virtual é uma frase, entre aspas, porque é o título de um artigo escrito e publicado em 1994 pelo sociólogo alemão Dietmar Camper. Dietmar Camper, que tem um livro traduzido já para o português, que se chama, pela editora Paulus, e que se chama Mudança de Horizonte. Então, é um sociólogo da imagem e sociólogo do corpo. E, então, esse título, que é uma citação desse sociólogo alemão, propõe tratar de três assuntos. Eu me proponho, dentro desse título, sob este título, tratar de três assuntos três blocos centrais. Primeiro se chama dados e abstrações. O segundo bloco, ao segundo bloco eu dei o nome de imagens e devorações. E ao terceiro bloco eu dei o título de custos e existências. Tá? Então vamos a eles. Tá? O que custa o virtual? O mundo dos dados é o mundo das abstrações. E o que é uma abstração? O próprio Nick Couldry usou a palavra abstração e deu um grande destaque a ela na sua fala, né? Embora ela aparecesse uma única vez ou talvez duas vezes. Né? Então, o que é uma abstração? A primeira resposta que eu daria é: uma abstração é uma variante da ausência. Tá? Ou seja, é uma forma de ausência. Então, vamos às palavras. Vamos às palavras, porque são elas que nos denunciam, né, o que está por detrás e que nos descortinam realidades ou escondem realidades. Ausência é uma palavra que vem do latim absentia e que vem da língua da nossa grande língua bisavó, o indo-europeu, do radical es, e que significa ser. E o prefixo ab significa retirada. Então, absentia significa a retirada do ser. A ausência é, portanto, a retirada do ser. Ser e estar, claro. Né? Nós, em português, acabamos bifurcando aí, né, bifurcando esse conteúdo em permanente e transitório. Né? Então, a ausência e a abstração têm em comum o prefixo ab, que é justamente a retirada. Então, o que significa abstrair? Abstrair significa trazer, retirar alguma coisa de alguma coisa que já existe. Que é a mesma coisa que subtrair. Então, abstrair é subtrair. Bom, portanto, a ausência é a retirada do ser. O que significa retirar o ser? Significa retirar aquilo que nos é constitutivo, aquilo que nós somos. Né? Significa retirar aquilo que é a nossa essência. E o que é que nós somos? Essa é uma bela pergunta para fazer. O que é que está sendo retirado de nós? Por meio de retirada daquilo que nos é constitutivo. Aí nós vamos à seguinte pergunta. O que são dados? Aí vamos pegar, né? Nick Couldry nos dá a resposta. O que é que está sendo retirado? O que é que está sendo extraído de nós? Nossos dados. O que são dados? São resultados das retiradas. Qual é a essência das extrações? O que está sendo extraído? É claro que faz parte do humano criar abstrações. Né? Faz parte do nosso desenvolvimento sobre o planeta. Né? Nos tornamos uma espécie extremamente exitosa no planeta, do ponto de vista da nossa expansão, do ponto de vista da nossa sobrevivência, né? Sobrevivemos como uma espécie, né? E segundo alguns entomólogos, que são os cientistas que estudam os insetos, ao lado dos insetos sociais, somos a espécie mais bem-sucedida sobre o planeta, ao lado dos insetos sociais. Tá? Só para dar um pequeno exemplo, as formigas, que são importantes insetos sociais, inventaram a agricultura 100 milhões de anos antes de nós. Tá? Só para a gente não se achar muito assim exitoso sobre o planeta, porque sabemos que estamos, afinal, destruindo o planeta ao invés de sermos exitosos. Né? Por essas razões tão bem expostas pelo querido colega inglês Nick Couldry. Faz parte do humano criar abstrações como ferramentas. Ferramentas para comunicação. Então, por exemplo, o desenho é uma abstração. A escrita é uma abstração. As imagens são abstrações. Não é? As tecnoimagens são abstrações, aquelas que aparecem nas telas, mas não apenas aquelas que aparecem nas telas. Não é? Também os nossos dados são tecnoimagens. Vamos dizer, são complexos informacionais e que não têm a forma da visualidade, mas possuem conceitualmente a qualidade de imagens. Isso é interessante, porque o conceito de imagem já não serve mais como definição apenas de visualidade. Não é? Até mesmo para os nossos sentidos. Não é? Nós capturamos o mundo por meio de outros sentidos, por meio do nosso olfato, por meio do nosso paladar, por meio de nossas mãos. Não é? Então, existem imagens táteis. Os cegos recebem o mundo por imagens táteis, não é? Por meio de nossos ouvidos. Não é? E, portanto, nós ouvimos o mundo, nós recebemos imagens acústicas do mundo. E por meio também da nossa própria percepção. Então, recebemos imagens de nós mesmos, do nosso organismo interno. Portanto, o conceito de imagem como apenas visualidade é um conceito absolutamente fora de atualidade. Imagem não é apenas visualidade. Então, o que são dados? Dados são grandes e complexas imagens de altíssimo grau de abstração. Então, aquilo que está sendo extraído de nós, são imagens de nós. Vamos dizer assim, imagens da nossa alma. Ou, talvez nós possamos dizer, o que está sendo extraído é a nossa própria alma. Ponto 2. Como as abstrações nos devoram. Tá? Ou seja, o que elas jogam fora de nós. Né? Porque devorar significa metabolizar. Metabolizar significa retirar algo e excretar algo outro. Então, esta grande metáfora da devoração, que, aliás, foi extremamente, lindamente bem utilizada pelos modernistas brasileiros, pelo movimento do modernismo brasileiro, né, pelos antropófagos, movimento da antropofagia, tá? Como metáfora, né? Mas a verdade, ela não é mais uma metáfora, ela é uma realidade concreta, dura, nua e crua. Né? Então, se a nossa alma que está sendo devorada, então o que é que está sendo jogado fora? Não é? O que está sendo cuspido? Ou o que está sendo excretado? Por dizer com a palavra mais correta. Tá? Então, se são retirados de nós dados e metadados e big data, estão sendo retiradas as nossas imagens. Está sendo imagens de altíssimo grau de abstração está sendo retirado da nossa alma. Bom, o que significa excretar? A palavra consumir, que vem do latim, significa em latim fazer desaparecer. Tá? Então, consumir, o fogo consome, o fogo faz desaparecerem as coisas. Tá? Então, o que é de nós que está sendo levado ao desaparecimento? Tá? São dois elementos constitutivos do humano. Couldry fala de um deles, e depois menciona, mas não se aprofunda no segundo. O primeiro deles, que Couldry trata magistralmente. O que é que está sendo consumido com este devorar a nossa, com esta extração da nossa alma? Primeiro, a vida social. Tá? Então, tudo aquilo que nos vincula a outros, que é constitutiva do nosso sucesso evolutivo sobre o planeta. A vida social. Nós somos quem somos porque somos sociais. Já ao nascer, não sobrevivemos, não fossem os vínculos sociais que somos hábeis em construir com o nosso entorno. Primeiro ponto. Tá? Então, o que é que está sendo consumido, levado a desaparecer? A vida social. Segundo ponto, o corpo. O que é que está sendo cuspido? O que está sendo excretado com este mecanismo? O corpo. E aqui eu passo para o terceiro ponto, para não estourar o meu tempo. O terceiro ponto, que se chama existências, custos e existências. Então, eu começo com o sentar e sedar. Um dos livros que eu escrevi e que foi publicado pela editora da Unisinos, por sinal, se chama O Pensamento Sentado. E a ideia desse livro é justamente trabalhar o outro conceito da palavra sentar, que é um conceito que, em português, foi um pouco deslocado, mas que no latim ainda está presente. Então, sentar vem do verbo latino sedere, que significa, em primeiro lugar, acalmar. E daí vem sedar. Então, sentar é a mesma coisa que sedar. Para que se retire a nossa existência social, que é constitutiva do nosso ser, da nossa vida afetiva. Todos nós sabemos o que estamos sofrendo agora, durante a pandemia, com a perda da riqueza e da diversidade da nossa vida social. Tá? Então, isto dói. E tudo que dói precisa ser sedado. Então, sedar. Ou sentar. Quando alguém está nervoso, a gente fala, senta, senta, senta para que se acalmar. Então, vejam, o aparentemente gratuito dos sistemas de informação, os sistemas de extração dos nossos dados, o aparentemente inofensivo, ambos têm um altíssimo custo. Tá? Significa, e por isso eles precisam ser sedados. Por isso nós precisamos ser sedados. E as imagens, as máquinas de imagens e todos os atrativos, que os extratores dos nossos dados nos oferecem em troca são mecanismos de sedação. Então, eles nos botam sentados. estou aqui sentado diante de um computador, vocês provavelmente estão sentados diante de um celular, diante de um televisor, ou diante de um computador, ou um laptop, ou um tablet. Né? Mas, invariavelmente, estamos sentados. Então, é o nosso corpo que está sendo sedado. E o corpo é a instância número 1 de resistência para a vida biológica. E depois para a vida social também. Onde não levamos o nosso corpo, não constituímos sociabilidades. Tá? Então, significa, qual é o custo que tem isto, todo esse mecanismo? O custo é que nós estamos entregando a nossa existência. E aqui eu paro de novo para falar sobre a palavra existência. A palavra existência vem do latim, juntando ex e x com o sistere. Sistere significa estar de pé. Tá? Significa estar de pé. O sistere vem de uma palavra do indo-europeu, que também dá a palavra stay em inglês. Que é estar de pé. Stand. Stehen em alemão, que é também estar de pé. Stay, que é ficar. Stand, que é ficar de pé, e assim por diante. Tá? Então, a existência significa estar de pé. Estar de pé significa estar de prontidão, estar ativo, estar alerta, estar preparado para o bote, para a defesa e para o ataque. E o ex significa para fora. Então, estar de pé, mostrando para fora. É isto que nós estamos entregando. É isto que nos estão roubando. É isto que nos estão extraindo a nossa existência. Ou seja, é isto que estão excretando de nós como bagaço. É a nossa principal constituição. São os elementos constitutivos do nosso ser. O corpo e a vida social. Tá? É isto que está sendo excretado pelos extratores de dados. Nick Couldry termina para oferecendo portas de saída. Como sair disto onde estamos? Né? É lindo a gente ver como ele oferece isso no livro. Né? Então, vamos reconstruir solidariedades, relações solidárias. Vamos repensar o coletivo, não apenas o individual. Né? Vamos repensar a nossa imagem não apenas como abstração, mas como corpo, como existência real. Né? E aí, perfeito, maravilhoso. Eu só acrescentaria ainda uma única coisa, uma última coisa, que foi proposta pelo mesmo sociólogo que perguntou, que escreveu em 1994, o que custa o virtual. Né? Ele nos chama de volta para o pensar corpo. Então, vamos pensar, não com as abstrações, mas vamos pensar com o nosso corpo. Isso, em alemão, ele construiu uma imagem Körperdenken, né? Que significa pensar corpo. Então, eram estas as minhas observações a respeito do Couldry. Obrigado pela atenção.
Professor Norval, mais uma vez, muito obrigado. Então, depois da conferência e das reflexões do professor Norval, agora nós abrimos para o debate com todos e todas. Nós já temos algumas perguntas que chegaram via chat do YouTube, do Teams. Novas questões também podem ser postadas nestes chats. Eu combinei com o professor Norval que faríamos alguns blocos de questões. Vou começar, professor, com duas questões, uma traz junto outra, então são 3 questões em 2. Primeiro, professor Norval, como o senhor percebe a possibilidade e a necessidade de uma governança global sobre os dados, sobre as extrações? Ou que outro tipo de controle seria ou será possível? E a segunda questão, professor Norval, o ensaísta Silviano Santiago nos alertou sobre o perigo de viver em simulacros da realidade a partir da digitalização de nossa socialização. Em um artigo republicado no sítio do IHU hoje, sobre o geógrafo Milton Santos, comenta-se que a globalização e, portanto, as tecnologias oriundas dela fizeram com que a natureza passe a nos ser apresentada como simples imagem. Sendo assim, o grande custo do virtual, conviver, eternamente mediado por simulacros desenvolvidos por... será, né, esse o grande custo, conviver eternamente mediado por simulacros desenvolvidos por dispositivos tecnológicos? Seremos em algum dia capazes de contato puramente humano com o real? Ao que devemos resistir?
Obrigado, Lucas. Eu vou precisar da sua ajuda para a gente recapitular um pouco a primeira questão, depois a segunda, que refere ao Silviano Santiago, e depois a terceira, que fala ao Milton Santos. Se refere ao Milton Santos, né? Tá? Então, me ajude, por favor.
A primeira questão é sobre a possibilidade e necessidade de governança global dos dados. Como o senhor percebe que tipo de governança ou controle social pode existir?
É uma questão bem difícil e é mais difícil ainda sermos otimistas nessa questão. Porque o que estamos vendo é que existe um grande poder daqueles poucos, né? A expressão usada pelo Nick Couldry é muito, absolutamente cristalina e simples, aqueles poucos que detêm toda esta energia das nossas almas. E aí eu me recuso a usar de novo a palavra dados. Não são os dados que eles estão roubando, é a nossa alma. Ou seja, é a nossa existência, incluindo o nosso corpo, nossa vida social. Então, uma governança global, meu Deus, não é? Como construir isto? Se não for pela iniciativa nossa, micro, individual, de cada corpo, que resolve falar assim, bom, é isto que eu quero, vou entregar agora a minha alma, não é? Ou vou brincar, correr, nadar, andar, dormir, não é? Comer, encontrar os amigos, não é? Então, como construir essa governança global se o Estado nacional foi destroçado por esta força mundial? Né? O que nós vemos hoje no Brasil é o resto, é o excremento do Estado nacional, de um país que nunca existiu enquanto país, né? Mas que em algum momento sonhou em construir uma soberania. Né? O que nós vemos, o que restou no Brasil, né? É o excremento, né? do que fizeram, do que fez o poder dessas coisas. Então, como construir uma governança global? Né? Me diga o nome da pessoa que perguntou isso, Lucas. Aí.
Professor, é que nem todos têm nome no chat. Isso.
Então, meu interlocutor, né? Você me coloca uma pergunta que eu gostaria de ter uma resposta, mas estamos todos procurando uma resposta. Depois, Silviano Santiago, como sempre, um brilhante pensador, né? Qual era o assunto do Silvano Santiago mesmo, Lucas?
A segunda questão cita o Silvano Santiago e os simulacros da realidade, e também cita Milton Santos na questão da globalização, né, de que a natureza passa a nos ser apresentada como simples imagem. E a partir dessas considerações pergunta, né, o grande custo do virtual é conviver eternamente mediado por simulacros desenvolvidos por dispositivos tecnológicos? Seremos algum dia capazes do contato puro? E ao que devemos resistir?
Sim, obrigado pela pergunta, é uma linda pergunta, né? Seremos, não seremos capazes, nunca mais. Por quê? Porque fomos nós que desenvolvemos essas abstrações. Essas abstrações foram ferramentas desenvolvidas por nós, a espécie humana, para lidar com situações mais complexas, e por isso, né, o que nós temos que pensar, o que nós temos que considerar é que nós desenvolvemos essas ferramentas, mas nós continuamos existindo como corpo, como vida social, continuamos existindo. Então, nosso pensamento tem que ser ecológico, num sentido de equilíbrio dessas coisas todas. É claro, não conseguiremos jamais abrir mão mais desta ferramenta que está nos colocando diante, vocês diante de mim, eu diante de vocês. Aqui, não vamos abrir mão disso. Mas temos que entender que este ambiente, ele não pode ser excludente dos outros ambientes, que são os ambientes do contato primário, o ambiente do corpo, o ambiente da sociabilidade, o ambiente da escrita, o ambiente da imagem criativa. Então, todos os outros ambientes que são graus diferentes de abstração. Então, a diversidade é a solução. A frase de Milton Santos foi um visionário, quando ele dizia isso. Transformamos em simples imagens, nesse sentido amplo da imagem como artefato de grande abstração. Então, o que temos que cuidar é criar diversidade de ambientes. Então, para que o nosso oikos, a nossa casa, seja uma casa de diversidade. Ela tem ela possui os instrumentos de alto grau de abstração, mas ela precisa ter também o ambiente do contato direto, aquilo que o nosso interlocutor chama de puro contato. Lucas.
Ok, obrigado, professor. Agora temos o nome. Quando tem o nome, eu posso citar para o senhor. Então, a Maria Rafaela pergunta: gostaria de saber do professor se o sentar, sedar, proposto por ele, tem semelhança com o epoquê filosófico.
Maria Fernanda, é isso?
É Maria Rafaela.
Maria Rafaela, isso. Oi, Maria Rafaela. Eu não gosto de traduzir conceitos de uma coisa para outra. Então, a filosofia toda construída em cima de conceitos, deu um nome, e aí a gente dá um outro nome. Na verdade, eu trouxe o sentar a partir de uma inspiração, evidentemente, de Nietzsche. Então, Nietzsche foi quem disse sentar o menor tempo possível e tal. E, claro, Nietzsche tem todo um pensamento que está ancorado também nos gregos, mas muito antes dos gregos havia filosofia na Europa. Havia filosofia. Nós temos que considerar o pensamento dos egípcios, os pensamentos dos povos semíticos, que todos eles trouxeram para a Grécia, contribuições incríveis, não é? Então, eu não gosto de traduzir conceito de uma coisa para outra, não é? Por isso que eu chamei de pensamento sentado, não é? E não usei um conceito grego, porque é um pensamento do corpo, não é? O sentar é alguma coisa que a gente faz com o nosso corpo, não é? Então, nesse sentido, né, eu peço a Maria Rafaela a licença para não traduzir o conceito de um lugar para outro.
Professor, uma pergunta do Tiago Salgado. Pensando a etimologia de comunicação como participar de algo, compartilhar, produzir o comum juntos, a condição de colonialismo de dados impossibilita a comunicação? Ou qual comunicação pode ser pensada quando imagens de nós nos são extraídas, expropriadas?
Tiago, justamente nós estamos aqui, nós, estudiosos, pensadores, professores, alunos e profissionais da comunicação, estamos aqui justamente para tornar possível esta operação, não é? Ou pelo menos minimizar os efeitos destrutivos deste tipo de estrutura social que está nos expropriando a alma. Eu, de novo, enfatizo, não quero usar os dados, não são os dados que estão tirando da gente, estão tirando a nossa alma. Não é? Então, para isso que estamos, reconstruir, primeiro, o estar, habitar o próprio corpo, e segundo, habitar o nosso grupo social, habitar a nossa família, habitar as nossas relações de amizade, habitar a nossa cidade, habitar a solidariedade, não é? De grupos maiores, não é? Não perder o senso de alteridade. Por isso que são fundamentais as profissões vinculadas à comunicação, cada vez mais. Não é? Cada vez mais. Obrigado pela pergunta, Tiago.
Professor, nessa mesma linha, eu lhe encaminho mais uma questão e depois, se me permitir, a última, e aí o senhor pode responder, por favor, e até se quiser fazer seu encaminhamento. Então, nessa linha do que o senhor estava trazendo, qual o espaço que o senhor percebe, espaço, papel, para o humanismo diante desse colonialismo de dados, dessa apropriação da vida ou das nossas vidas? E a última pergunta, o colonialismo passa muito por quem detém a infraestrutura tecnológica necessária? E quem possui os recursos naturais para essa infraestrutura, como os minérios, como a questão dos minérios, por exemplo, que papel teria ou que possibilidade teria?
Vamos ver se eu consigo responder. Espaço para o humanismo. Temos que resgatar de volta tudo que perdemos. Não é? Aquilo que nós chamamos de humanismo é a nossa essência. É a essência da nossa natureza. Não é? É o título do Instituto Humanitas. Significa, estamos correndo o risco de perder ainda mais espaço. Então, temos que resistir, não é? Por todas as formas possíveis. E depois a questão do colonialismo de dados, e qual o espaço o espaço que nos restou, né, neste latifúndio, usando aí a expressão de morte e vida severina. É a parte que te cabe neste latifúndio, ou seja, a sua cova. O espaço que nos restou como país, como nação, produtor de commodities, soja, né? Um país que já estava se industrializando, né? Criando riqueza mais elaborada, né? Dentro do mundo que só valoriza isso. Né? Então, é difícil, não é? né? A escolha que o mundo fez para nós. Vocês vão produzir soja, commodity, e vender soja bruta, navios e navios que vão de soja, carregados de soja, grãos de soja, num mundo que está trabalhando a informação, né? E aí, um navio de soja em troca de um celular. É desesperador, né? A gente pensar nisso. É assim que estamos, e é assim que, enfim, né, o país como um todo, né, criou ou educou seus cidadãos, entre aspas, para aprovar este tipo de programa para o país. Né? Então, estamos muito mal obrigados como país. Né? Ou seja, continuamos sendo a colônia do pior tipo de 500 anos atrás, onde vinham retirar o pau-brasil, onde vinham retirar o ouro, vinham extrair o ouro, né? E agora, então, por isso adorei a perspectiva trazida pelo Nick Couldry, né? De pensar, né, o modelo do colonialismo. O que é isso? O que é construir a colônia? Né? Eu cito aqui o meu grande mestre de comunicação da Alemanha, Harry Prof, né? Harry Prof, que foi o fundador da teoria da mídia na Alemanha, lá no final dos anos 60. Né? E ele dizia o seguinte, você expropria o tempo de vida do outro. A comunicação a comunicação, a estrutura dos meios de comunicação significa a expropriação do tempo de vida do outro. Na medida em que você expropria o tempo de vida do outro, né, que foi um dos tópicos que eu não tratei aqui, não é? Mas, na verdade, quando eles tiram a nossa alma, estão tirando o tempo de vida. O tempo de vida é uma fonte de recursos esgotável. Né? Nós não temos prorrogação. Quando bate o sino ou a foice da velha senhora, né, não adianta a gente pedir 5 minutos a mais de prorrogação. Né? Então, é uma fonte de recursos esgotável. E é o nosso tempo de vida que está sendo roubado, né, pela mídia, por este tipo de mídia. É claro que existe a mídia que também constrói, construtiva, e nós, pesquisadores e profissionais da comunicação, temos que estar atentos para isto, né, para esse aspecto. Tá?
Muito obrigado, mais uma vez, muito obrigado, professor Norval, obrigado também ao professor Nick Couldry. Agradecemos a presença de cada um, de cada uma, de todos e todas. Nosso muito obrigado também ao CEPAT, que fez a transmissão do evento pelo Facebook. Lembramos que esta e outras conferências estão disponíveis no canal do YouTube do IHU. Lembre-se de curtir e comentar os vídeos e compartilhar os conteúdos do IHU nas suas redes sociais. Acesse ihu.unisinos.br, assine a nossa newsletter para acompanhar os nossos conteúdos e eventos. Aproveito para convidar todas e todas para assistirem à terceira conferência desse nosso simpósio, que ocorre no dia 14 de dezembro, às 19h30, e tem como título Inteligência Artificial e Capitalismo Digital na China pré- e pós-pandemia, com o professor Dr. Jack Q, da National University of Singapore, de Singapura. Muito obrigado mais uma vez, até a próxima, tchau, tchau.
Eu que agradeço, Lucas, agradeço a você e agradeço a todos os nossos ouvintes e espectadores. Não é?